Can I just say, first of all, that I feel like such a tech genius just looking on like three different tabs right now and two screens. There's so much going on. But anyway, let's just start then. Hi everyone, my name is Toby and I am the Student Union President at the University of Birmingham. And I'd like to say a big thank you for coming and welcome to our Decolonization in Practice conference. It's it's definitely very, very heartening to see so much interest, both from the University of Birmingham and, of course, the wider student movement in our conference. And I'd just like to start by thanking the National Union of Students for the help and support in planning and promoting the sessions and just being super generous with their time. Thank you very much. Now, this conference aims to just do one thing, and that is to provide all of us with the understanding and tools to decolonize the curriculum and our institutions. And, it's about moving away from discussions that are theoretical, but into like the more practical business of actually getting things done. And in order to do that, we have an incredible lineup of colleagues from the CERT movement, academia, and beyond, just providing us with case studies, skills, and insights for the next 2 days. We know that this work obviously is very vital to tackling the injustices that plague higher education today. Take, for instance, the attainment gap between Black and white students, which is still far too high, and far too many students tell us that they don't see people like them being reflected in their curriculum or their institution. And I think more fundamentally, however, is that the legacy of colonialism is still alive and well across higher education, and in how virtually every subject is taught and conceptualized. um, and we believe that if students are, to truly understand their field of study, then this definitely has to change. And it's very clear that the government and the Office for Students are not going to do what is needed here. So to put it simply, it is up to us. And, this is why this conference was very, very important to us. And because we believe that only by educating and supporting a network of activists can we truly face this challenge. But that is enough for me. It is my great pleasure to introduce Larissa Kennedy. Larissa is the former president of Warwick Student Union and a trustee of the British Youth Council. She's now the incredible president of the NUS. In all the roles she's held, she's been a champion for all students and has been doing a truly stunning job holding the government to account and being a voice for students throughout the pandemic. So please join me in a virtual round of applause for our first speaker, Larissa Kennedy.
Thank you so, so much, Toby. I'm really, really excited to be here and to be, supporting on this conference because it's true, we've come so far in the conversation about decolonisation and really uprooting racism. And now we have the opportunity to talk about what that looks like in practice and how we drive that forward as a movement. And, if we were in person right now, usually I would probably shout across that we'd inevitably be in some like poorly lit lecture theatre or something. At 10 a.m. on a Wednesday morning, and I would usually like get people excited about this and ask you what 3 words come to mind when I say decolonisation. So I'm still going to try and do a little bit of virtual interactivity, so feel free to jump in the chat and let us know for you what are the 3 words that come to mind when we talk about decolonisation, because it's really great to get an idea of where people's heads are at when I say that, and often to see the kind of threads of similarity between what people's experiences of decolonisation and what it means to them are up to this point. So don't be shy, jump in the chat, let us know, give us your 3 words, or if you can just think of one, chuck one in. If you think of more, I'm not gonna tell you no. But yeah, it'd be good to hear from you, and let me know what your 3 words are, and then I'll kind of start to share the beginnings of a definition for me or for us at NUS. So yeah, just want to start off with that. But thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome, Larissa.
And Toby,
Do you still want to do the slide?
yes, yeah, I'll put
Okay.
them up in a sec. It's just because when I put the slides up, I can't see the chat. But if you want to share words that come to mind for you, Toby, as well, do let us know when we say decolonisation, like What does it make you think of? Like, what immediately comes to mind? It's just nice to hear from people. Otherwise, I'm just talking to a screen once I put my slides up. But yeah, if not, we'll let that kind of come through. Oh, reclamation. I love that. I'm probably going to get into that a little bit in the kind of presentation. Justice, anti-hierarchical, freedom. Oh, those are beautiful, especially anti-hierarchical. You know, I think it's talking, when we're talking about it in practice, like how do we actually live and breathe that? It's going to be so interesting. Colonial matrix of power. Yeah. Straight. I don't know if you meant that in terms of like cis heteronormative, but yes, absolutely. And I think looking at how we decolonize gender and our understandings of gender and sexuality and all of those things are so interesting. These are already, I'm like, everyone who's in this space is on fire already. Redistribution, unlearning. Yeah, I think there's this really interesting dichotomy that I hope we get to speak a little bit about around unlearning and learning. Or I continue to put them in the chat. I'm gonna jump into the presentation, but it's just really, really interesting to see where people are at so far. So let me just start to share my screen and get into it. So if I can figure out how to work my own laptop. You know, the way that I begin to try and define decolonization is around actively striving to grasp at the roots of structural oppression in our education system and to radically reimagine the systems and structures of our institutions through an anti-racist and anti-oppressive lens. And of course, you know, I cheated a little bit. I asked you folks for 3 words and did way more than 3 words myself. But what I can do is start to break that down into 3 pillars that I see as really crucial to this conversation. Because, you know, when I say all of the systems and structures of our institutions, that's because we often talk about decolonizing curricula. And of course, that's really crucial, you know, decolonization from the perspective that universities are sites of knowledge production, knowledge sharing, spaces of learning, teaching and assessment. But I think there's also the university as a site of community and decolonizing the manifestation of racism between the ways that students, workers, both academic and non-academic, and then, you know, within this marketized framework, an inherently problematic management structure all function in reproducing racism. And then, of course, there's kind of the university in relation to everything else. Like, how do we decolonize the economic, social, political impacts of the university on the surrounding community and the wider world? So I think if we take the kind of first of those pillars that I described, you know, sites of knowledge production, I'd say that decolonization is about challenging what is recognized, legitimized, and by extension, delegitimized as knowledge or as forms of knowledge production. And so I think the point that was made in the chat about unlearning is a really important one, because it's really about stripping back what we've been taught to legitimize and delegitimize, which of course is kind of inherently interlinked with what is researched and what is then taught, but equally the way that it's taught and assessed. And I think one of the really interesting parts of this area of thought for me is around decolonizing pedagogy and things like decentering authority surrounding knowledge and who holds it, and really challenging how pedagogy feeds into the racist structures of our institutions. And then, of course, we need to do this across different disciplines and in interdisciplinary work, because I think there's often this misconception that only certain disciplines need to be decolonized, but of course, it's the institutions as a whole. So then that kind of second pillar around racism as part of the university community and how that's kind of embedded into the university community. And this is the kind of definition I began to give before. And I put on the slide the chant that if you've been to a protest as a student, you may have heard many a time, I know I have, whose university, our university? Because, you know, this really is a question of who is at this institution, who does the institution belong to? And I think once you start on this pillar, you begin to ask questions like, what's the experiential reality of people of colour at the institution? What is and isn't considered acceptable within that institution? If you report racism, what policies are there to recognise what you're experiencing? Who do these policies protect? And who's deciding this? And I think think those are all really important to think about, because of course interpersonal racism continues to be an issue, and the kind of result of the ways that institutional racism legitimizes racism in our day-to-day experiences as students of colour, as Black students. Which I think also leads into the question of demography, like who has access to that institution and why, and who holds power to shape these institutions. And within the kind of incredibly flawed, corporatized, centralized management of universities within the marketized framework, it also calls into question who holds the power to shape these institutions, and how do we decolonize and democratize the very running of them. And kind of then, so this, yeah, that's the kind of community pillar that I often speak to when talking about decolonization. And then looking to the last of those sections, you know, I spoke about like what's beyond, like how does the university function in relation to everything else? And I really think we need to do more to connect all of those conversations to how we decolonize the university as a wider actor within society, particularly critiquing the economic relationships that universities foster. And thinking about how we action tangible community solidarity, because I think, you know, as a movement, we need to redress the fact that universities often take a very isolationist approach to their locality. And this can often reproduce a kind of colonial legacy, particularly where you have like white majority institutions in the middle of or adjacent to Black and brown communities, and the impacts that that often has. But also, as well as community solidarity and looking at the locality, on the flip side, or kind of as an extension of that, thinking about what tangible international solidarity looks like as well, and how can we hold universities complicit in the ways that they are impacting people of colour in the global south predominantly as well. Because, you know, there's often complicity in war, in the climate crisis, which is obviously having a direct impact here and now, particularly on people of colour in the global south. And I think there's so much more to kind of delve into with that conversation that we might not have time for in this session here, but I'm really excited about unpacking. As we see more and more organising throughout the student movement for decolonial divestment. So I guess that kind of is my cheap way of saying my 3 words around knowledge, community and beyond. And I hope that kind of gives people a bit of a taster of how I like to conceptualize decolonising universities and decolonising education institutions. But of course, the conference is about decolonisation in practice, and now that we've done the kind of precursor to it, I'm excited to get into that a little bit more. Because Pokelé speaks about the 5 stages of decolonisation. The first being rediscovery and recovery. And I think when I first heard this, I had to take a step back and be like, whoa, because what this is really talking about is starting to, or beginning to even try to conceptualize how much has been lost, how much we don't even know that we don't know because of colonization, and how much there is yet to rediscover and recover from those lost histories, from those lost stories. And you know, that it's beyond even our wildest dreams. I don't think we can even fathom how much we have lost, how much there is yet to rediscover and recover. The second stage of this is around mourning, and you know, recognizing that when you're trying to come to terms with how much has been lost, how much has been taken from us, it does lead to a stage of mourning. It does need to be processed adequately, and we need to create the space for that. I mean, often, you know, because of the types of institutions that we're trying to navigate within, we're doing this work and there's a deadline or there's a set timeline or whatever, and are we creating the space to actually reflect and mourn what we have lost, and what we're then trying to rediscover and recover. The third part of this, the third kind of section of this, is my absolute favorite. Everyone who follows me on Twitter, anyone who knows me knows I talk about dreaming a lot, because I think it's one of the most intentional things that we can do in, you know, furthering the movement for decolonization is continuing to dream. and creating this space for dreaming. And I don't think we do that enough. And you know, often it's not something that can have a KPI or that you can put, like, it can't be truncated. You need to just create space for joy, for rest, and that's where dreaming is often able to thrive. And so I think also, if you get the time this week, take the time to have a think about how you can make that step towards dreaming and really regularizing dreaming, which I'll talk a bit about in a second. And then the fourth stage is around commitment. And, you know, I'm going to talk about this in a bit as well, because I think what we are really well placed to do as a student movement is drum up an understanding of what decolonisation is, so that people can make a tangible commitment to this movement. And then, of course, the fifth section and the fifth stage is around action, and really taking, like, you know, defined action to further this movement. So let's get into a couple of those a bit more, because I think there is some particular areas where the student movement can, and I hope will, make some headway over the next couple of years. Because this really, for me, this part around commitment is about movement building. It's about how do we empower people at the grassroots to have the resources and the tools that they need to really be drumming up commitments, and that doesn't have to be in the most kind of, like, everyone needs, like, I need people to say or state or whatever that they are pro decolonisation. I need that kind of quite literal. I'm also mean that, how are we creating the spaces for people to come to this commitment, particularly for people of colour? And that's why I love the kind of the word in the chat at the beginning about being anti-hierarchical, because I think this commitment shouldn't be like, okay, I'm leading Decol, and I want these people to come on a journey with me. It's about everyone having the space to find commitment within themselves through spaces of learning, through spaces that provide the opportunity for people to come to that commitment. And I think fundamentally, if we want to make that sustainable and we want to make that continue on, that's about building organising spaces. And these often are able to regularize the moment of dreaming so that people then come to that commitment. And I think that is so, so important. And I know that allyship is quite controversial, but in the institutions we're at, particularly at, you know, quite heavily white institutions, I think there is also a role for drumming up the commitment of allies, and of course holding them to account in that, and recognising that allyship is a verb rather than like a noun, a label that you can attach to oneself. But yeah, really, how can we build commitment for this work? And then action, and you know, there's way too much to cover on this in one slide, so I'm going to get into that in a bit more detail. But the things that I'm hoping to cover around action, I think there's a huge sentiment within the student movement that we need to connect the conversations around divestment, disarmament and decolonisation. There's the role of, you know, what does, you know, once we're talking about divestment, what does radical, what does, you know, meaningful investment in people of colour look like? And then some work around transformation. So let's get into that, because there is, you know, the role of the decolonising movement in railing against universities' complicity in things like the arms trade, the immediate impacts of the climate crisis in the global south, but also quite directly the erasure and invisibilisation of scholarship from both people of colour here, but also people of colour in the global south as well. So I think this is really, really important to be connecting these conversations, and when we're doing organising work around this, to do it in the most holistic sense. Then, you know, what does investment actually look like? I think it's literally the flip side of all of that. So how do we make sure that universities are moving beyond empty platitudes? Because particularly in relation to the Black Lives Matter movement, we saw universities coming out saying Black Lives Matter. Some of them even struggled to say the word black. And that is the kind of dire state that we're in right now. So how do we move beyond those empty platitudes, those black squares that they were putting up, and actually put their resourcing behind supporting the work of students, not only within the academy, but also beyond it. And I'm going to talk a bit later about how we do work beyond the academy, because of course there are limitations to the work that we can do within it. And then also thinking about, what does it mean to invest for change? And I'm really excited that there's NUS is working with Students Organising for Sustainability UK around what investing for change looks like. Because, we're telling universities to divest, but they have all of this resource. Of course, we're in a difficult context now, but let's not forget universities have a lot of resource and can make tangible difference. And students can really drive that difference. And then, of course, there's the role in, funding and supporting research and scholarship of people doing the work around decolonisation. So I wanted to talk a bit about what the movement in the UK is looking like, because we've got this really problematic customer framework, as I was saying at the beginning, that really wants students to be this kind of passive receiver of education. And of course, once we're talking about decolonisation, we're really flipping that on its head, because we're seeing students as actors in shaping what their education should and could be. And apologies, it seems to be an old version of the slides. But really, I think what I wanted to say there is around how we then connect the work that we're doing here in the UK to the work happening globally, because, and I want to talk in a second about the global decolonized movement, because of course we are standing on the shoulders of giants and must recognize where the kind of inklings of this and the beginnings of this were, and of course that was predominantly in the global south. So this is why that kind of leads me to speak about internationalism within that movement, because as I say, the histories of this movement come from the kind of Roads Must Fall work and that organising movement in Cape Town, which of course led to Roads Must Fall in Oxford, which really drove forward the Why Is My Curriculum White work that happened in Leeds and other places around the UK. And the way that this global movement is inherently interconnected, it kind of means that when we're picking up the baton of this work, it's kind of incumbent upon us to continue those threads of internationalism and make sure that yes, we have threads of international solidarity in our work, but also that we are continuing those conversations in terms of how we continue to do this work and what it looks like and what it feels like. And I think that's really, really powerful. And so, I've been in this role about, I think, 16 weeks now, and we've already had the opportunity to speak to organisers who represent the kind of All Africa Students' Union, the Namibian and Ghanaian Students' Unions, about reimagining universities through an anti-colonial lens. And I think the only way to do that in a kind of authentic way is to constantly be in conversation with those doing that work in the global south. And then also wanted to mention that this learning process is one that I feel very that I'm continuing to be on, but I feel very privileged to have accessed. And so trying to share that learning where we can. And so so far we've also started to train up student officers in Denmark who were interested in really having the beginnings of that conversation in Denmark as well, because they're just not at the stage that we're at in the UK. So as I said, I wanted to get into a little bit of the limitations of decolonising the academy, because I'm really, really, really excited about the NUS Decolonise network and how we're going to be supporting, using this campaign to support local action and local activism around decolonisation. And of course, there are absolutely waves we can make. Don't get it twisted, like I'm talking about limitations, but there are absolutely ways we can make in building sustainable organising communities for folks to really be uprooting the ways that our universities are built on historical genocide, enslavement, displacement, and all of that. And I think, as students, we are so well placed to be driving forward that conversation. But for a second, I want us to think about, like, what are the limitations and how do we kind of usurp those? So You know, I saw a really interesting tweet the other day that said the only way university organising will ever truly enact meaningful and permanent change is the day we abolish universities as we know them. And I just want to dwell on that a second because, you know, I think there is so much that we can do, as I was saying, to drive forward this movement. But at the end of the day, we've already seen how much institutions have attempted to dilute and co-opt this conversation. Because conversations about decolonisation, as I was saying, were being had from when, you know, the Roads Must Fall movement was really, really taking off. And we saw when we were having conversations about the Black attainment gap, it got reduced and reduced and reduced and reduced until we were literally talking about, oh, Black people need mentors and that's going to solve everything. And it became this very truncated, reductive conversation that was putting the onus on Black students, you know, to level up or whatever people wanted to frame it as, without making a tangible commitment to actually uprooting the ways that racism manifests within these institutions, the fact that they are a very product of colonialism, and that just was not being, that wasn't being wrestled with in a real way. And, you know, recognizing that it's not in the interests of these institutions themselves to do that work, like, because it makes us question, you know, who's managing these universities and why are they getting so much for it, and why do we have this management structure that is so hierarchical and all of these things. That once we're questioning all of these things, it's not in the interest of these institutions to do that work. And so we can never fully trust these institutions to do it themselves. It has to be a grassroots-led movement. And so I thought this idea about abolition of universities as we know them was so interesting, because we also see a lot of the ways that universities function relies on many forms of elitism, which of course is never going to be compatible with anti-racism. And so I think it's really exciting that we could be really thinking anew about what a decolonized, what an anti-racist, what a truly pro-Black liberation space of teaching and learning looks like. And you know, we see universities as the space for knowledge production, but actually universities, we know them, are just a construction of what a space of knowledge and learning could look like. And we have the liberty to really build in our minds through dreaming, as I was going back to, I love dreaming, through dreaming, to build what we see as those anti-racist spaces of knowledge production. And then I put this meme on the screen because I was like, this really sums it up, to be quite honest. Because if we look at, you know, the solutions that have been put forward to anti-racism, we've been talking about how we uproot race and how we talk about these fundamental ways that it's sewn into the fabric of our institution. And these, they've just been looking away. They said, I'm not sure. You know, we're constantly seeing institutions pretend to commit to anti-racism and actually just kind of stall and delay that work actually happening. Meanwhile, students continue to push back, and we see it on a cyclical basis as well, because they know that, you know, students come in, for the most part, they're there for 3-4, you know, kind of years, and they continue to like act brand new and act as though these conversations haven't been had. And they do that purposely because the liberal anti-racist work is much more palatable and digestible for the institution, because it requires only surface level change as opposed to grasping at the roots ways that racism is manifesting. So that meme really speaks to me. It really speaks to my experience trying to do radical anti-racist work, and just is a reminder that decision makers and the institutions as we know them today aren't going to be coming to us wanting us to do this work. It's about us creating spaces to do this work outside of their framework, which I guess leads me back to the conversation about organising beyond our institutions. And, you know, I'm really overjoyed that in many ways, I get to do a lot of this work within NUS, but also outside of my role at NUS, I make up a small part of the team at the Free Black University. And FBU is a hub for radical and transformative knowledge production. You know, as I was just saying, we've seen the fight for decolonisation going on for years and years and years. And it's actually the recognition that, you know, the current education system, universities as we know them, are limited in what they can offer us. They are limited in how much we can really do. So how can we build spaces of knowledge production that are built by and for Black people? And I know that Ty from the FBU team is going to be speaking at the conference later in the kind of conference. So I'm really, really excited to hear from Ty, because this is about kind of an Afrofuturist perspective that really centers Black healing, but also, you know, what does it mean to build a space from the perspective of Black liberation, as opposed to trying to tack it on once these institutions are already, in some cases, decades old, some of them even more, and have already sown racism into their very being. So I think building spaces beyond our institutions is so, so important too. So I guess the last thing for me to say is that this is about people getting involved. There's no hierarchies, there's no you need to know all of this before you jump in. None of it. I think, as I was saying, a commitment to dreaming, a commitment to action is all that you need. This is about a constant learning process for all of us. And I'm just so, so excited to see the student movement take that on and create those spaces for people to continue to do that. So I think one of the things that we've been saying to people is help shape the campaign. If you feel like you really want to get involved with this, you know, the NUS Decolonised Education campaign over the next 2 years is really going to be building that grassroots support for students to be really taking this on, really taking this on, because it's not about, you know, any one person or any group of people leading. This is about collectively making sure that our national union is serving the interests of grassroots organisers. And you don't have to be a grassroots organiser TM to get involved. Like it's all that means is that you have a commitment to doing this work and you want a space to do it. So please jump in. Like if you're a student, if you're an officer, whatever you're up to, let us know. You can find it on the NUS Connect website, how to get involved. Because I think we've termed it critical friends that we're looking for. We really want this campaign to serve what you need it to, in terms of providing tools and resources. So do get involved and help shape the campaign. We've also got some resources that have been created throughout Black History Month, because we just launched the campaign at the beginning of October. And, you know, there's a podcast around, we did an Insta Live answering some questions around this. And of course, the rest of the conference is going to be an incredible space to continue this conversation and keep all of us collectively getting to grips with how we move forward with this in a really tangible way. And, you know, if that throws up more questions than we have time for today, or than we have the space for today, then feel free to reach out to me via email, via social media, because as I say, like, I'm still learning. Our team, I think, has a commitment to continual learning as a form of, you know, decolonisation. I think that's so, so important. So yeah, if you think there's stuff I've missed or there's more stuff you would add, because, you know, I get the joy of delivering things like this for students across the country all the time. So I'm always open to hearing your thoughts about, you know, what we've been talking about here today, but also, you know, if you don't want to ask a question here, then feel free to drop me a line. But yeah, what I'm going to do now is bring down the presentation and just get into it. If anyone has any comments, questions, feelings, thoughts, wants to get involved, let me know. And just thank you so, so much for listening. And yeah, our movement is so powerful, like seriously so, so powerful. And when we collectively come together and organise at the grassroots, and I'm just so excited to see what we do over the next few years, and so grateful to the Guild for really putting this on and making this happen, because this is so exciting. Like once we get into it, they can't stop us. It's by force or by fire. We're going to make sure that we pass on the baton to the next generation of students who are going to continue this work, and that this work lives beyond us. And that's what we're building. So I'm very, very excited. I'm going to stop sharing screens so I can see people's questions, comments, anything. But yeah, again, thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Larissa. I think that was very, very thorough. If I came into this conversation having no knowledge of decolonisation, I think that was a very, very good start and very, very Oh my goodness, I don't know what was that. But you know, it was really, really insightful. Thank you. And I think just as some point of reflection, just based on what you said, decolonization is a learning process. It's more than just a curriculum. It's a global conversation, and by no means an easy task, driving forward the movement. And like you said, these conversations have been, you know, somewhat diluted by universities, and you can see that where, you know, instead of decolonizing the curriculum, for instance, is more focused on diversifying it and not really paying attention to like the root causes or like, you know, other things in between, which are like two different things. And we did have a question, and before I just I think, yeah, I have a couple of questions for you as well, but just before I ask you those, I'm going to ask you this one, which I think is very, it's going to be very interesting for people to have idea about. So it says, what did you do at Warwick on decolonization, and what did you learn? And of course, how did you get started?
Yeah, okay, that's a fun question. So at Warwick, basically, I started out in my second year. I was president of the Warwick Anti-Racism Society and the Warwick Anti-Sexism Society, and to be honest, I actually remember the day that I, like, in my mind, I was like, this is the work that I'm doing, because we had our freshers fair like before COVID, like when everything was normal, and we had our freshers fair, and I remember it was day 4 of those students' university experiences, and you know, they were telling me about these experiences of racism that they had, and I was just like, we're on day 4, like how has this happened already? And so as a committee, like I went back to my exec, and as a committee we were like, right, we're going to do a research report. And so we kind of got some people together, kept listening, like did basically a listening exercise to hear from Black students, from students of colour, about their experiences. And then we literally went straight to our VC, and were like, these are the things that we want to work on. So I think the 4 areas that we're talking about was like the academic disparities that students were facing, the mental health experiences they were having, and, you know, not having any counsellors of colour, feeling like the ways that they were expressing their experiences with mental health weren't being taken seriously. And then the third area was around like the social experience, and the ways that like racism was manifesting interpersonally, and how that was impacting things like mental health, but also their performance and all of these other things. And then the fourth area people were talking about was like, why are we so minoritized like in an area? Because Warwick is situated in Coventry, which has quite a thriving Black community, and it just felt like there was a real problem in terms of access, particularly for local Black and brown people. And so we had these follow-up meetings with university managers, and like not many of the actions were followed up on. And we were just thinking, like, we were looking at our VC, and I remember us talking to each other being like, this guy's not about it. Like, so we went again, and like we ran a whole campaign called Warwick Speak Out, and set up this kind of online reporting tool where people could be completely anonymous. And then, you know, we were just hearing horrible things, like reports of racism from university staff, from lecturers to academic tutors, to residential life tutors, campus security, staff within the immigration department, members of staff in outlets, like then also perpetrated by fellow students, like in academic settings, in accommodation, in societies. And then there were things like verbal offences, like slurs, there was like racist jokes, if people not even call them that, like so much stuff, and even some quite harrowing physical experiences. And we put this all together, and just as we finished doing this report, I actually became a SAB. And so I basically took this report on tour, and just shook the institution basically, and was like, nah, like you need to understand what's actually happening here. And then use that to build the momentum that we needed to set up the Warwick Decolonise project, which actually it kind of employs students and actually remunerates students for doing decol work. And so we have a setup there where students get paid to kind of look at how we decolonise the institution, but not only the curriculum, but all those other areas I was talking about. So yeah, sorry, that is like my backstory, from being a kind of local anti-racist organiser through to being a SAB and setting that up.
Yeah, thank you, Larissa. I think that's really interesting, and it's just very similar. And even here at the Guild, just seeing the lived experiences the students have been through, and how it affects them socially and academically, and just wanting to do something about that. So, thank you very much for that. There's been a couple of questions that have come in, but just out of interest, when you mentioned the Black Lives Matter movement, I found that quite interesting as well, because a lot of universities have only just started addressing decolonization, for instance, just out of the Black Lives Matter movement. And I guess my own question would be, how can sabbatical officers approach, the universities and explain that it's a deep-rooted issue, and it's not just about ticking the box. So it's just so that they don't come off as tokenistic in the sense.
I think SABs have quite a difficult role in terms of treading this line of utilizing and negotiating with the institution and using the resources that you have as a SAB to secure those movements towards Black liberation, but also, being accountable to and working alongside students. And I think something that I wish I'd done more of is actually recognizing that your power as a SAB really can come from students at the grassroots. Like, if you feel like you're a SAB and they're continually, like, you're saying these things and they're not listening, they will listen when there's hundreds of students knocking on their door, obviously digitally in this sense, but and you can be a vehicle for coordinating those things and supporting students to do that work. And I think so often, going back to the kind of word that was thrown in the chat, anti-hierarchical, I think if we're thinking about what an anti-hierarchical, a truly anti-racist, move towards decolonization looks like, it's about empowering people to have their say. Like, if the university isn't listening, we take it to a point where they're forced to listen because students upon students upon students are calling for this. Do you know what I mean? I think there's also, going back to the kind of limitations of these universities, like, what do we want from them? And let's do that on our terms, because I think for me the key thing is about resource. And if they're not putting their money where their mouth is, then we have to hold them to account. And that's not all on one or two people. And I think often it's like, Sabs, what are you doing to hold them to account? And it's like, I know from experience how hard it is when you're sitting around a room. For me, it was always like an all white team looking back at me, and I'm there trying to make the case, and that is personally, emotionally exhausting, to have to justify why this needs resource all the time. Like, I remember coming out of meetings and just being so tired. Like, why do I have to fight so hard just for you to realize that students deserve to be remunerated for doing the work that you should have done decades ago? Like, they are literally improving this institution beyond their wildest dreams, and yet people see it as something that should just be on the side of people's degrees that they're doing anyway. They take it for granted. And so, obviously depending on what you're looking for, but I think my two pieces of advice would be, don't forget that students are your power. But be very clear on what you actually want and need from the institution, and don't expend too much energy trying to convince people that your life and Black people's lives and people of colour's lives hold worth, because it's emotionally exhausting. So though, I guess those would be my kind of key pieces of advice.
Oh,
But
that's
hard.
amazing.
It's hard.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. There's a question from Sean Russell, and says, if you were to abolish current universities, what would a new university look like?
Oh, I love this question. I think in many ways for me, this conversation has to be ongoing. Like, it has to be it's not like I could construct it today, because the very point of abolition is about presence rather than absence. So building that presence has to come from community, right? It has to be something that we collectively conceptualize as what an anti-racist system of knowledge production looks like. But in my head, I'm like, obviously the initial thing is that education would be free, because as soon as you marketize education, as soon as you position students as customers, as soon as you act as though education is a kind of something to be bargained with in that way, you completely change what the kind of systems and structures of education look like. And that's never going to be conducive to anti-racism. So I guess that's kind of the first pillar for me. I think the second thing is around, you know, what does truly accessible education look like? Because you can't have an anti-racist system of education that is exclusionary and hierarchical, and that, you know, forces people to conform to a certain way of education. And I think we've so like been forced to buy into this, like, this is what education looks like, and actually looking at like alternative routes to education, and what, you know, accessible education would look like for neurodivergent folks, for people who learn in different ways, because at the moment that just does not happen, and that conversation is not happening adequately. But also recognizing that Black and brown forms of knowledge production, or historically Black and brown forms of knowledge production, can and should be much more expansive than what our current education system allows for. And, you know, I'm by no means an expert in all of these different disciplines, but even beginning to talk to, you know, some of the ways that we were looking at decolonizing, what's the name of the department? Psychology, and talking to folks in that discipline about, you know, the ways that people are taught these really immersive forms of, you know, the psychological discipline in such a like book and pen and paper way, and actually thinking about how that would look if it was led by Black and brown folks who actually came up with these forms of, you know, these really immersive forms of thought in the first place. And like, what would it, okay, forget universities, what would it look like if you just wanted to learn, seek knowledge, and share the learning that you have? Like, it just wouldn't look like one person standing at the front of a lecture hall and potentially hundreds of people just sitting there and listening. Like, we all have things to bring to the table. We all have, you know, our experiential knowledge, and you know, it just wouldn't, the ways that we learn really centers the idea that one person can hold and be the arbiter of knowledge, as opposed to really decentering that and thinking about the ways that we exchange knowledge between us, which is actually, for me, or in my head, the much more decolonial form of looking at this. So I don't know, it feels like I didn't particularly answer the question in, I think, the way that was phrased and wanted to be answered. But I think the kind of thing I'm trying to put across is that the possibilities are endless, because the way that we do knowledge as we know it today is just so inherently problematic. And I think there's so many more ways to exchange knowledge outside of the scope of what we know.
Yeah, certainly. I think there's a lot to unpack there. And it's just literally the summary of that question is, what does decolonization actually look in practice? Like, if you take out all of the, you know, the downsides, what does it look like? And, you know, if you stick around throughout the end of the conference, throughout the next 2 days, there's quite a lot of incredible things to be taken out of there. We've got a couple more questions coming, and there's another one that says, so this is from Anonymous, how can course reps utilize student staff liaison committee as a space for campaigning for decolonization? And there's a follow-up question that says, do you think decolonization can be achieved from corporate structures like that at university?
Well, first off, I love the question because it recognizes that, like, the way that we do like course reps automatically just corporatizes the idea of student feedback. Like, it shouldn't be like you give feedback or it should be co-creation, right? Like, education should be co-creation. But we use what we have, we use the tools that we have to have our voices heard. And so I absolutely think, like, do you know what, course reps for me are so important. Like, I was education officer at Warwick, and seeing the course rep structure and seeing the fact that, like, these are the people actually on the ground with the roots into their actual courses. And I think there's so much of a role for course reps to play outside of those structures that they sit within. So how could, like, if every single course rep was holding, like, say, town halls where students could hold kind of course conveners to account for decol work, like, just imagine if across the country, every single course rep that existed, and there's thousands of them, literally was like, right, we're going to hold a town hall and we're going to hold you to account for how you're using resources to make sure that we're on the road to decolonising education. Like, that would be so powerful. Imagine if every course rep, you know, got students together to have like a reading group, or to support people to learn more on their course, to learn more about decolonisation, and then give their opinions about how we start to do this within our institutions. Like, I think course reps are literally such an untapped resource of our movement. And like, I love chatting to course reps about, you know, how they can start to disrupt this idea that they're supposed to fit within the corporate structures of student feedback. And like, I don't know, it's so exciting to me that we can do that as a movement and have the opportunity to do that as a movement over the next couple of years. So basically, if you're a course rep and you want to do that work, let me know, drop me a line. And yeah, because I'm well excited about it.
Thank you very much, Larissa. And I guess another thing that I'll just add to that is, you know, just equipping the course reps as well, you know, with details on decolonization, because there's some people who are passionate about taking this work forward, and they probably don't have like the basics in terms of, you know, knowledge and all of that. And I know the NUS is, you know, putting a lot of resources together, and that's something that could be very, very helpful for course reps to get involved in. And that there's another question. So there are quite a lot of questions, but I really especially like this one. What is a SAB? It keeps coming up and I don't know the
Oh,
abbreviation.
sorry.
So sorry. Do you want to go, Larissa?
Yeah. Yeah, so sorry. If I'm using any other jargon, let me know in the chat and I'll unpack it. But SAB is a sabbatical officer, is what it's short for. And SABs or sabbatical officers are elected to work full time elected to work full time to represent students at their union. So, for example, Tobi is a SAB
Yep.
for folks at the Guild, or there's like across the country there's teams of sabbatical officers who are like the executive for their students' union, and so are working like full-time, or in some cases you know, almost full-time, or you know, depending on the union, but yeah, for the most part full-time to represent students. So yeah, sorry about that.
Sorry. So sorry about that. Yeah, so sabbatical officers take time out of their studies to represent you at your university, as at the student union rather. Apologies for all the jargons that we've been throwing around, but please feel free to pop in the chat if you have any other questions. And we've only got 4 minutes before
Oh my
we
gosh, wow,
close off, but we
brilliant.
still have a few questions. So quickly, maybe we can, like, you know, go through these questions quickly. There's one here. In your experience when talking to universities, this is from Emma, is it best to focus specifically on one of these, or the overarching oppression and the intersections?
Wow, I feel like you can't have one of those conversations without having them all, but I don't think that negates understanding the specific lens of what's impacting a certain group. And I say that not to mean just necessarily Black students or, you know, trans students, but to say like sometimes there is a specific experiential reality for, say, Black trans students that needs light and that needs space to speak about. But I think all of these conversations are so interconnected, and when we're talking about decolonisation, as I said, we're talking also about decolonising gender, decolonising sexuality, you know, all of these things. So I think we can connect them, and as organisers, we absolutely need to connect them. But sometimes when we're speaking to the university and we need to get specific resource for certain groups, I think there's definitely space to be talking about, for example, the situation of Black women or Black LGBT folks, or, you know, as I say, sorry, I'm trying to answer really quick now.
Yeah. No problem. And I'm just going to say, you know, from a sabbatical officer perspective, I think it just figure out how your university works. If your university works at a very slow pace, then I think it's very, very proper for you to pick your battles, figure out, you know, what you want to focus on, go ham on that, and then take it one step at a time. But yeah, let's move on to the next question. This is from Iad. Sorry, I hope I pronounced your name correctly. How do you assess your campaign? What breakthrough you've made in this deeply rooted colonized system?
So I think, you know, this idea of sometimes the ways that we frame assessment or indicators or whatever can be quite a colonial framework. And as I was saying, like when we're talking about regularizing the moment of dreaming or of building that commitment, like it's not always something that you can put a tick box against and be like, yes, I'd like X number of students are now dreaming about decolonization. Like I almost don't know how to quantify it sometimes, and that makes it quite difficult, particularly when we're working within structures that to get resourcing, you often have to like somehow quantify things, and it's ridiculous. So I think almost disrupting that idea that it's quantifiable. But in terms of seeing progress, I think this is why it's so important to do kind of the work of archiving, because often we see the erasure and invisibilization of this work as years go on, and particularly the kind of cyclical nature of the student movement means that sometimes we lose this work. So making sure to write stuff down and to archive it so that the kind of next set of students are able to start from where you left off, as opposed to being pushed back to the beginning of that journey, is really, really important. Sorry, I'm still trying to answer really fast.
Yeah, I know, and I'm really sorry, guys, if that was, rushed in any way. There's a question that says, how can you educate yourself about decolonization in theory and practice? And I guess just what we could do is, we have the Discord server up in the chat, and then we can like share some resources there. I'm really sorry. And then last question, it's 11 o'clock already. If you guys do not mind, we can take this last question, Larissa, if that's fine by you. I can see how, so this is from Stuart. It says, they say, I can see how history, literature, language, etc. can be decolonized. How would decolonization work for science and medicine curricula? Yeah, this is a really interesting
question
one.
For our literal last minute. But I think that's a really common misconception. And actually, so one of the places that we started with the Warwick Decolonise project was the medicine department. And we were looking at, how can we unpack the fact that there still is an attainment gap, because of course if racism wasn't an issue within science, you just wouldn't see an attainment gap in science subjects, which you still do. You wouldn't see science students still being subjected to racism, which you still do, and all of those other things. So when it comes to medicine, for example, we were talking about the fact that many of the instruments that medicine students were learning about were actually tested on Black women without anaesthetic, and they weren't learning about the histories of where those instruments came from. There's also the side where lots of the ways that diseases or kind of illness manifests was only shown on white skin. So people weren't even able to recognize the ways that certain ailments were showing up on Black people and on brown people. And there's just so many other elements. As soon as you start to unpack it, you begin to see how many different problems there are, how much racism manifests within even like science. We started to do that work with physics as well. We don't even have the time to get into it, but like,
yeah,
we really did. We were like, concertedly, we're going to start with science, and we're going to start doing that work, because it can happen, it needs to happen, and Black and brown students within science departments deserve that we do this work there also. So I'll leave it there. Sorry that we don't have
definitely. Thank you, Larissa. I think that's been very helpful. And just to say, we have a session on decolonizing evolution and ecology at 3 p.m. So please tune in for that, and hopefully, we can explore and unpack that further. So we are out of time, but thank you so much for joining us in opening the Decolonization and Practice Conference. It's been amazing, very, very insightful. So to everyone who's watching as well and listening, thank you so much. If you haven't already, please join in on the discussion on our Discord server. The link is somewhere in the chat, and I think it should also be in the same place as you got your Zoom links as well. But that will be all from me. Apologies, we've gotten 2 minutes over, but yeah, we'll see you shortly for our next session. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.